yeah, as I said, this is just something we do. It's a very natural tendency, but sometimes it can be very unhandy as well.
My name is Katharina, and I'm the Community and Event Manager at eCulture, a company that is on a mission to shape the world of unbiased hiring. Welcome to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. On today's episode of the Oops, I'm Biased podcast, we are starting a new series. We are doing short but sweet bias deep dives, starting with self-report bias. I have my lovely colleague Zsuzsanna join me for this. I hope you enjoy this episode. There'll be further reading down in the show notes for you. There's lots to talk about. But yeah, without further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode. Right. Welcome everyone to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. It is so great to have you all tune in again. This is actually a very special episode. As you might have known, if you're a long-term listener, we do these bias deep dives quite a lot and how they relate to recruitment. But we are starting a little mini series where we do quite short ones on specific biases that I think impact quite a lot on recruitment and HR itself. For this reason, I brought in a very dear colleague of mine, Zsuzsanna. I think I'm going to let you introduce yourself in a second to discuss this first one. She has a background that is quite related to it, and I'm very excited to be tackling self-report bias with you. Welcome, Zsuzsi. I'm really happy to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's very exciting. I'm very excited to be doing this. Excited to talk about self-report bias as well. I have a background in psychology myself, so it's I like to talk about these topics, and I've been with eCulture for 2 years now. I'm an account manager, so I'm responsible for initial conversations with the organizations who are interested to learn more about eCulture. So I'm always happy to discuss anything related to unbiased hiring and how the mind works, really.
Amazing. Well, with that introduction, I don't think I could have an expert on that would be more fitting for this one. Would you give us a brief introduction on what self-report bias is? Give us a bit of a definition.
Yep, absolutely. So self-report bias refers to the incapability of people to accurately evaluate themselves. Incapability is a very strong word, of course, but people do have a tendency to not being able to accurately judge themselves. They very often tend to underestimate or overestimate their skills. It's a very natural thing, really. It's all very subjective. So this is just something we do.
Yeah. Follow up then, where does it come into play in our personal lives, in our work lives? And how does that then manifest when you say we can over and underestimate ourselves? Where does one or the other might come up more often?
Good question. I think it's really an everyday thing. Just really small situations as well. Like if I'm asked to judge how much coffee I can still take during a day, how much I've had, how my quality of sleep was based on, just information that I kind of remember, how many times I woke up, it's not accurately measured. So it's just present in very tiny things like that. But of course, in more pressing matters as well. I remember in the beginning of my career, especially, I really struggled with, kind of estimating my chances in the job market, but also my skill sets, what I can bring to a workflow. I think it's probably something that people really recognize, especially when they're looking for a job. So that's something that I'm also trying to stay conscious of, but that it just creeps in, right? As I said, this is just something we do. It's a very natural tendency, but sometimes it can be very unhandy as well.
Yeah. While I was prepping for this episode, I was thinking about where would I over and underestimate myself. And I remember reading about, especially with career, now that you mention it, we're very much likely to overestimate our skills and expertise if we don't know a lot at the beginning of our career, and then very much underestimate probably our skills and capabilities the more we are advancing in our careers, because the more we find out that we actually don't know things.
Yeah, and then it gets intimidating, and but that's interesting as well, that in the beginning you're just, okay, let's go, I can do it. sometimes that's a very good thing, right? It can bring you to further places as well because you appear confident.
Yeah, indeed. Is there a specific example that came up for you? Now, you already mentioned one in our day-to-day lives where you think this exemplifies it really well, other than the ones that you already talked about.
I think especially in work, of course, because you're very dependent on your environment, on your colleagues, on the projects you're working on. So if you're responsible for something, it is very easy to just inaccurately estimate the time, the effort that you need to put in, but also how you have to present yourself and what you can take out of it. How do you communicate that outwards? And that, again, it can go both ways. It can be that you're overestimating it a little bit and that just gives you an extra boost of confidence, or going the other way around, and then it unfortunately takes a step back with you.
Yeah. Now that we've covered a little bit how it manifests in everyday life and what it actually means, can we move on to recruitment? Could you give me an example where self-report bias really impacts recruitment?
Yeah, so I think it is quite common in recruitment. A lot of organizations choose to work with tools that are relying on self-report assessment. That's very often in the form of a questionnaire, personality questionnaire. So the candidates are asked to judge themselves in personality traits or how they would deal with a certain situation. And this is where things can go wrong because of this inability to really accurately judge ourselves. If we're basing decisions solely on this can get tricky. And another thing that's quite relevant here is something called social desirability, which is, simply put, is just the tendency to present ourselves in a favorable situation. So we want to make sure that we seem in a light that we think would be acceptable to the other person who is judging us. So imagine if you're being asked to, I don't know, would you confront a colleague if you have a clash over a project? You're really gonna think about, okay, what do they want to hear from me? How should I answer? And you might answer according to that rather than what you would naturally do in that situation, which makes a lot of sense. You want to appear in a way that's favorable, but then how reliable is the data? So if you're really basing decisions on this can really become a problem because it just affects the validity of your data.
Yeah. It's quite interesting what you mentioned, because I think most of the biases that we talk about, there's always a bit of an element of, is this conscious, is this unconscious? With the social desirability coming sort of intersecting with self-report bias, then it becomes really conscious. Would you say that that's true?
It can be. I don't think it's always conscious. It can be a very unconscious thing as well. It can be a lot of stress that's adding to it. You just want to make sure that you're there. It's not that candidates are lying outright, for example. I think it's a mix of both. You can, of course, very consciously decide, okay, I'm going to present this version of myself. But very often it's just an unconscious behavior as well.
Yeah. Where exactly, if we're talking about a recruitment process, then very specifically saying application, interview, assessment, offer stage, where do you think self-report bias comes in the most?
Usually in the beginning of the funnel. So you do see often equal amount of candidates, for example, if you're talking about gender split, applying to a certain role. But already there, you can see a difference in just people reading job descriptions. If it's very hard requirements, it can be intimidating. You can be thinking, okay, I'm not matching these requirements. I'm not even gonna hit apply. But then if you're confronted with a questionnaire or any kind of assessment that's really asking you to judge yourself, we do see, especially again going back to gender, we do see females really significantly underestimate themselves. So then they just fall out of the process already at the very beginning. So they often don't even get a chance to go to an interview. But imagine you're presented in the interview with two people with the exact same skill set, with the exact same background. Who are you going to go for? The one who presents themselves more confident or the one who's lacking that a little bit? So that's a tricky part as well. I think that can present anywhere in the process, but I think it's very problematic if it's already in the very beginning.
Yeah, you just mentioned that there are very stark gender differences when it comes to recruitment in itself. Sort of how do women and men in this example now present themselves? Could you tell us a little bit more about why that might be, and how then, because you said already impacting, sort of, would you then hire someone who doesn't present very confident? How does that come to be? And is there anything that can be done about that?
Yeah, good question. It's $1 million question, I think. Luckily, there are way more conversations about it nowadays, which is a very good thing. That has been around for a very long time, but it's just scientifically proven that females are underestimating themselves, their skills, their chances. What we do see is that you do get a lot of female applicants as well, in the beginning of their careers. But then later on, if you look at gender split data, it's just, especially in managerial positions, females are still very, very underrepresented. So there's something in between that's happening. And of course, that's due to a lot of different reasons, societal reasons, raising children, all this kind of thing. So that's a lot to unpack, I think. But if you just go back to self-report bias itself, if you start with the notion that females get less chances if you're using these kind of tools, if you're basing this data only on that, then you're just seriously limiting your talent pool itself and how you can broaden it a little bit.
Yeah, it's great that you bring that up, that there's quite a lot of intersection between self-report bias, gender confidence gap, but then also social desirability. I think those three make it probably really difficult then for certain society groups or minorities to actually then advance in their careers or be more successful. Yeah,
absolutely. It's indeed, it's not just females. It's really any type of minority roles. Also, if you're talking about neurodiverse candidates, we know that they have a tendency to underestimate themselves. So they already have a backlog on when they apply, how they apply, how many chances do they get into an interview phase even.
Yeah. It's great then that you bring it also back to the core of, it starts with knowing about self-report bias. That in itself is something to be taken into account when you're structuring your recruitment process, when you are employing certain assessments or interview questions. I think the ones where you sort of presented with a scenario and what would you do, those are probably also quite prone to overall underestimating how you would act in those situations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Would you have any sort of tips or best practices for our listeners who might be recruiters or leading recruitment teams on how to minimize the impact of self-report bias?
I think wanting to know how people reflect on their own skills and behaviors is a very good thing. It's a good conversational starter. I think it's only a problem if you're basing decisions solely on this, but it's not that you should avoid it completely, because it's interesting, it's relevant, it's something that you want to explore with the candidate themselves. The ideal situation, if you are able to use a tool or just a method that is allowing you to measure competencies or skill sets in an objective way. So that's not relying on a candidate having to judge themselves. And then when you're moving to the interview phase, use structured interview questions as much as possible. That's what I would suggest.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this short and sweet episode, talking all about self-report bias. I will link the social desirability episode that we did a while back with our head of science, Leonie Grandpierre, in the show notes. I will also link a blog post article that our science department did on gender confidence gap. I think this might also be quite useful further reading if anyone's interested and hasn't seen anything about that yet. Is there anything that I didn't ask you or that you think is super important for us to mention before we are done with this episode?
No, I think it was quick and dirty. I think we covered a lot of things in 10 minutes time. So yeah.
Amazing. Well, I hope that you enjoyed coming on this episode. I really enjoyed our conversation. For everyone who listened today, thank you so much for tuning in. We are a bi-weekly podcast, so be sure to come back in 2 weeks' time where we continue our bias series, and let us know what you thought of it and which biases you want us to cover next. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.